Welcome to Full Press, a media criticism podcast where listeners and viewers can escape the mainstream media echo chambers for a precious 35 minutes every 2 weeks. My name is Harrison Lowman, managing editor of The Hub. What are we going to get in today? What's on the docket? Vice President Vance goes after our immigration numbers and the CBC. CBC's premier investigative current affairs show ditches balance to help sell safe supply drugs. We'll examine a documentary from Fifth Estate. And after 10 years, a decade, potential closure at last on the biggest Me Too case that rocked Canada and Canada's writing community. Welcome, Peter and Tara, to this episode. How are you guys doing?
Well, thanks.
That's great, thanks.
Tara is joining us from a Louisianian garage, I think, is where you are now.
Yeah, we're visiting family in Louisiana, and I am in a converted garage outside the house, coming to you live from there.
Awesome. And Peter, you're in the basement.
Yes, a converted basement.
Nice.
So.
Okay, let's get into this. So Vice President Vance starts tweeting. I always find, where do these guys find the time to be doing this? But he tweets, "Well, I'm sure the causes are complicated. No nation has leaned more into diversity is our strength. We don't need a melting pot. We have a salad bowl immigration insanity than Canada." Then he shares a graph showing G7 nations. I think it's GDP per capita, which shows Canada not looking so good. It's a graph from IceCap Asset Management. He then goes on to say, "With all due respect to my Canadian friends whose politicians focus obsessively on the U.S., your stagnating living standards have nothing to do with Donald Trump or whatever boogeyman the CBC tells you to blame." Also surprised he knows what the CBC is. Tara, what did you make of that salvo that was launched from across the border northward?
In general, I think it was unhelpful. I mean, our immigration conversation has been a lot, I think, more humane than the immigration conversation across the border. We have seen, unfortunately, a collapse of our decades-long nonpartisan consensus, pro-immigration consensus under the Trudeau Liberals. And I think that was a real tragedy. But I am proud of the fact that our country and our media have managed to have a conversation on immigration numbers and the sort of material conditions. How is housing? How is healthcare? These sort of things, as opposed to the language of insiders and outsiders. And I'm really glad that we've avoided that to date. And I was unfortunate to see Vice President Vance jump in that way.
Peter, it gets all the more awkward and unfortunate and strange when the CBC has to cover itself. And I'm wondering how you thread this needle. CBC has to basically cover this, the vice president coming after it. In many ways, I don't know, it felt, at least in the immigration side of things, that they were playing backup for the government when it came to the immigration numbers. They write, "The government under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had already begun cutting immigration after it rapidly increased during the post-pandemic labor shortage. Prior to Prime Minister Carney taking office, the Liberals had already indicated that they're shrinking temporary foreign residents." As opposed to, in my mind, at least playing to the fact that we saw historic numbers when it came to rises over the last few years. Mike Moffat, "In the last 3 years and a half, Canada has grown by 3 million people, the level we typically experience in a decade and slightly more than we experienced in the entire 1990s. How does the CBC cover itself and cover immigration in this regard? What do you do in this case?
Well, I mean, it's defending the country in that sense. It's sort of taking on a political role when it does that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean that it shouldn't. It should balance what one person says with a set of facts or what another person has to say. The thing I find mostly amusing is how big a fuss we can make over it. And in making a fuss over it, we kind of make his point that we obsess about the United States. I mean, healthcare is a great example. All we ever talk about in terms of healthcare, anytime somebody tries to reform healthcare in this country, everybody goes, oh my God, American-style healthcare, without ever thinking that there might be another model, like UK-style healthcare or Swedish-style healthcare or German-style healthcare. We tend to obsess. And they, as Vance illustrated, enjoy obsessing on us from time to time. If they talk about reform of their healthcare system, people are like, oh my God, we don't want to be like Canada. Tens of thousands of people die on waiting lists there. So, Vance is just kind of using Canada and the Republicans' popularity do, Kanakistan. Um, you don't want to be like them,
It's fun. Yeah.
sort of thing. And we do the same thing. We don't want to be like them. And I find the whole thing incredibly childish and parochial, right? Rather, there's a big old world out there, and all Canada can ever see is, thank God we're not the United States, and the United States goes, thank God we're not Canada, and they both sides get bogged down in a puerile exchange.
It's funny we're seeing these comparisons be made all the more with Alberta changing its healthcare system. And to Peter's point, Tara, like we are made the boogeyman sometimes, right? Like Republicans point to us, especially during the Trudeau years, as being like this is the final state of like post-nationalist society. If you don't defend what we have, you'll become Canada. It's like woke in its final, in stage 4 woke cancer. This is what Canada is. Is that fair to say that we're also like a boogeyman to them?
I think so. I think we could make our case a lot better if we didn't have so many internal problems. I mean, there are points to be made about our leadership and about the state of our country right now. And I think we would be in a much stronger position in any kind of conversation if we tended to our home fires a little better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move to block 2, which I'm going to call Bugged About Drugs. It's about a documentary that all three of us watched, I think, this week, which made, I don't know, waves in certain places. I think other people sort of nodded along as they watched. CBC's Fifth Estate, which is, advertised as the premier investigative journalistic show in Canada, aired something called The Political War on Safe Drugs. In my view, I'm interested in yours, it's near journalistic malpractice. They're looking at safe supply. The feds are dropping funding in regards to safer supply, so they dive in. Who do they not speak to? They never speak to anyone who's really criticizing safer supply beyond clips of politicians giving sound bites. No anti-safer supply experts, as Adam Zivo, who's been reporting on this for some time, almost single-handedly points out. No one really getting into the harm from diversion. If you guys recall, in the system, folks who are addicted to very strong drugs are given less powerful drugs by the government in an attempt to replace what they'd usually be taking. Instead, featured a raft of addicts who basically advocated for more safer supply and the expansion and legalization of all drugs. One expert at one point says Canadians have a constitutional right to have access to illicit drugs. Anyway, it was just interesting for me, and I'm interested in your take, the fact that they call it a political war, and journalism so much relies on conflict, and yet they kind of only show one side of the story. What do you think, Peter?
I thought it was very disappointing. It was it was documentary style, and it was done with an assumed conclusion, and then all the work worked towards proving that conclusion, that safe supply is a good thing, and that people who are getting in the way of it are just making political points. They proved the diversion point, but then they just kind of ignored it. And I think there were a couple big faults. One was taking addicts at their word in terms of being sources and interviewed. And I think we're all called upon to have great sympathy for these folks. It's a dreadful, dreadful condition to have that level of addiction. But in my experience, having to deal with colleagues, friends, others who are addicted, honesty is a challenge for folks when you're in that state, and we should be doing everything we can to help them. And I think the debate properly centers around whether safe supply is the best way to help them. And they never got into that. There's sort of this assumption, the clips of Poilievre and Smith and Eby, for that matter, being opposed to it, but never sort of giving those people the opportunity to present that their point is one that comes from a sense of compassion for those people, and that the argument, and so does the people with safe supply. So everybody is actually well motivated, but somebody is right and somebody might be wrong as to what is the best way to help people in a truly dreadful, physical and emotional condition. So I don't think the public was well served by this faux journalism.
Yeah, it was like this. The consensus is that safe and safer supply are the answers, and it's like how much
Yep.
of it should exist. It's weird because there is a model, and again, this is not saying that there's this huge group of people that are anti safer supply, but this is a group of people, including experts who exist, and for you to not speak to them at all is not giving the public a sense of the debates going on. When it
Yeah,
comes to this,
yeah.
Zivo
I've
saying.
always maintained that bias is the most obvious in what you leave out, not what you put in.
Yeah, and there's a model going on in Alberta which focuses, overwhelmingly on treatment. They could have gotten to that. They could have showed the success of that and the numbers behind there. Instead, Zivo says their thesis was straightforward and nakedly partisan. Safer supply is a wonderful evidence-based policy, and conservative opposition to it is rooted in reactionary politics and scientific ignorance. Tara, what did you make of how the issue was shown on TV screens across the country?
I think just from an informational perspective, there was a lot of gaps there. I mean, the thesis is organized around the idea that there is a political war going on here, but we don't understand what the war is about and who. I mean, we saw very brief clips of conservative politicians. We didn't hear arguments from them. And the idea that this is politically unpopular safe supply is predicated on the notion that this is unpopular with public opinion. I mean, so, but why? I mean, we didn't hear from many members of the public. We didn't hear from any arguments against safe supply. We didn't hear what the points of contention are between both sides. We didn't hear if there's a third or fourth side to this debate. There really was just information gaps. And I will also add as well that one of the subjects who is addicted to drugs in this documentary is described as two-spirit. That is not explained to the public. I'm not convinced that the majority of Canadians know or understand what it means to be two-spirit. And as well with the pronouns, using they, them throughout the documentary, I found it a little confusing. I would have liked them to front load that and say, this is why we're using these pronouns. It just was sort of taken as an assumed understanding from the public. I just think they could have done a whole lot more explaining throughout the documentary. And I think it's unfortunate. This, as Peter said very well, I think this is a huge issue in our country. It impacts all of us. It's devastating for families and for individuals and for the public as a whole. We really do need to dive into this. And it was disappointing despite the Fifth Estate's very illustrious history as a program.
Here are the stakes, guys. 52,000 Canadians have died from an apparent opioid overdose since 2016. 18 people die a day in Canada of fentanyl. All this to say, we care about these people. We have to find a way to get out of this. We all agree it's a crisis. But politicians don't exist in a vacuum. What are conservative politicians reacting to, and why has public sentiment seemingly moved away from safer supply, thus ending the funding? The politicians don't exist in a vacuum. They're responding to public sentiment of people who are saying, we need our parks to be safe and cleaned up. I don't want this stuff near my kids' kindergarten. These sort of perspectives need to be elevated because they're there. They created this war that the documentary is seemingly named after. Premier Wab Kinew, an NDP premier in Manitoba, recently came out and talked about how we can't be prioritizing the wants and needs of addicts in our cities above the general community. We need to get them into treatment and help them. And it just seems like that is entirely absent from this documentary that's supposed to be giving us the full story on CBC. And also, I think using similar phrases, and Peter, you can get into this. You came across an article journalists just adopting the language from public health and some of these activists and talking about unregulated drug supply instead of what everyone knows is street drugs. Why do we feel this need to adopt this language that A, no one's understand, and then B, is clearly on one side of what is a very contentious issue? Where does that inclination come from?
I'm not sure. It never seems to cross their mind, does it? Somebody comes up with and says, okay, this is the moderate approach, right? When it could be an extreme approach, but it gets reframed as moderate. And they just go along with it. Or they prefer not to engage in any pushback from people, because activist groups will push that language forward and say, if you use that language, you're going to get people upset. People are going to feel bad about themselves. I don't know. In extreme cases, they'll say people are going to commit suicide if you don't use the proper pronoun and that sort of stuff. And so journalists just sort of default into that. And I think a lot of that has to do with poor management in newsrooms, where the managers never say, no, look, we're in charge of the language. Here, we choose what language we use, and we should be choosing neutral language whenever possible. Whether people, want to describe themselves as pro this or anti that. And throughout this program, as Tara was pointing out, they use the sort of wokish, I guess it's the best way to describe it, language without explanation, which to me indicates that within their culture and inside their newsroom and their production process, there's nobody there who goes, "Hey, wait a second, guys. Why don't we need an explainer on what Two Spirit is?" I don't think everybody understands what Two Spirit is, but everybody in that process obviously understood what it was. So there's a difference between what it really illustrates is the difference between the culture that dominates in newsrooms and the culture that dominates at your Tim Hortons when you go for coffee.
Journalists need to I don't know, have some sort of barrier or force field in that understanding they're not a part of the story. When you're met by people who say you can't bring this up because the stakes are death, which shuts down any debate, right? As soon as someone says that, it's I just want to let you know that if you do this, people are going to die in Canada. We need to be rational and, suck the emotion out of the air and report accurately, right, Tara? It just seems, I don't know, repeatedly, whether it's this issue or the trans issue, you're met with folks who are if you engage in these ideas, these people are evil and morally repugnant on the other side. And if you engage in these ideas, I just want to let you know, you'll have blood on your hands. How do we deal with those phone calls, those emails from viewers across the country when that happens?
Well, I think, as I say all the time, we really need to stay calm and stay rational and try to take some of the emotion out of it so that we can think clearly. And I guess I would also just say to journalists across the country, I mean, we have been taught for many years not to take what activists say at face value. And there's a reason for that, because activists have a political agenda. Now, that may be a really healthy thing for our country. Their agenda may be the right way for us to go, but it's not our job to adopt their agenda. It's our job to present that agenda and to question that agenda and to allow viewers to think through. These are very, very complex issues. And there were a number of points in the documentary where I would have liked to see some pushback. One of which was there was a physician, I believe it was in Vancouver, who was part of a program giving out drugs to users, and she didn't feel the program was effective, and she ended that program and received threats from drug users. And in explaining it, she said, I understand why people are angry to lose their supply, and then went and developed a stronger drug that she could then prescribe to patients. And so those moments are, I think, times when the viewer is going to naturally say something like, you received threats and this didn't, mitigate your thinking in any way. Or, I mean, there's just natural points of questioning throughout these documentaries. And I don't understand why you can't just ask those questions. And perhaps that physician has a really powerful, incredible answer to that, but we miss it because we're just taking everything at face value.
I think empathy can be a tool and a crutch, right? So much of good journalism is connecting with people and getting to understand where they're coming from and their suffering and what they've been through, and then putting it on the page so that someone can literally read that and be I feel like I'm in that person's head. And it can also be to your detriment, right? You can get so attached to it, you begin to believe what the person's telling you, and you can't separate yourself from the source. Is that a thing, Peter?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of virtues such as compassion and empathy that leads into this, where you're sort of, and that's where the program failed to engage in that debate, that's fundamental. That's the fundamental issue. One group is saying people are going to die unless we give them what they want, right?
Yeah.
And the other group is saying, so how does that end?
How does that
They
end?
die,
Yeah.
right? How does that end? Where does that get you to? It keeps them alive until tomorrow, maybe, but how does that end? So, these are different types of expressions of compassion, and as Tara was pointing out, one is reason based, and the other one is based on sort of moral relativism, or emotion based. So this is what I feel. I feel like I want to help these people. So this is the way I'm going to go. And then you get that feedback. Journalists get that feedback from people. And I would say that you know, obviously newsrooms are leaning in that direction on the sort of relativism versus reason base. And all of this is actually an expression of that very broader um, uh, evolution in our society away from ration and reason as a core, and more to a sort of relativism where everybody has their own reality, and if I feel this way, then this is the way we must go. So I see it largely as an illustration of that without overcomplicating it.
All I'm
I
asking
also
for is
think
to
we have to constantly be asking ourselves on these things, like, what if we're wrong? What if conventional wisdom is wrong? What if the activists are wrong? What if we are reading this story wrong? And anyone who's been a journalist for any length of time knows that stories evolve and change over time, and that, like, the story we're going to talk about next is a great example of that. And I think we just have to have a lot of humility every step of the way, and know that we're very frequently wrong about these things. We have to be low certainty. It may well be that the harm reduction model is the best way to help people who are addicted to drugs. It may well be that it's not. And we, sitting here with our limited expertise, don't know. The public doesn't yet know. So we have to, I think, exercise a lot of humility in these conversations as well.
certainly the status quo is just not working. So I think we agree on that. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to move Tara into this, our last block. A fit for Can Lit is what I'm calling it. This is like, the Globe had this huge spread over the weekend about a guy named Stephen Galloway, who is a professor and acclaimed novelist, who was suspended from his job at UBC and eventually fired. It rocked Canadian journalism, the literary scene. Tara, can you just break down? There's a lot of different, moving parts to this, but just break down like what happened here and why it caused such controversy that it still bleeds into today, 2025.
Mm-hmm. So 10 years ago, Stephen Galloway, as you say, an acclaimed novelist and the head of the creative writing department at UBC, was suspended. And UBC released a statement immediately saying that there were serious allegations, but not explaining that. And it turns out that he was having an affair with a student. Both he and the student, I believe, were married at the time. And the student was not young. The student was, I believe, just a bit older than him. And so this person maintains that the affair that they had for several years was abusive, and he maintains that this affair was consensual. And a couple of things to note: there have never been criminal charges brought for the assault that this accuser says has happened. And the UBC did an investigation, and on balance of probabilities, could not find any evidence of this assault. This case has been working its way through the courts. There is a defamation case that has had a number of appeals to try to hold back that case. That case is going to go forward now. And Justice Adair in Vancouver found some quite troubling aspects of this case in her recent decision, which I've read. All of that is to say, this is a hugely contentious story. It ripped apart Can Lit. There was a letter written by Margaret Atwood and other writers like Susan Swan at the time, about a year into the case, saying that UBC owed Stephen Galloway due process. And then that letter really ripped apart the community. And people were at a point where they lost friendships, lost work. People couldn't sit on the same panels as someone from the other side. Just a horrible situation all around. And now we have this Globe piece 10 years later kind of dissecting it.
Peter, this is another example of, like, as a journalist, how do you report using empathy but not letting it get ahead of the facts and figures of the story. He denied it, said it was a consensual affair, went on to, in his words, destroy his life. He ended up left like shoveling gravel and cleaning pools. He does not write at all anymore. I looked online, like he has not had really any appearances in 10 years. And yet, yeah, his victim's still saying that, he sexually assaulted her. How do you begin to report on something like this that's so supercharged? And if we recall at the time, it was even that much more supercharged, the Me Too era.
Yeah, and what worries me is that I don't think anybody's learned anything from this.
Mm.
Newsrooms get swept up in the emotion of these movements, and phrases, believe the victim. We have to believe the victim. Gomeshi was, another incident, and everything gets carried away that here's an accusation. It happened to John Furlong as well, although he got it dismissed, but it wrecked his life to a great extent. Accusations like that. So for media, like you have to be very careful with this sort of stuff, and you I would think that media needs to look at these things the way the court system might do, with a presumption of innocence. That's the way that usually goes with it when you're looking for justice. However, people get swept up in whatever the phraseology is for movements and that sort of stuff without ever really understanding the consequences of that. So if you say believe the victim, right, and you adopt that, and you succumb to the activism behind that, well motivated and well intended as it must be, you need to push back and say, why? Why should I believe every victim? Why should I believe everybody who describes themselves as a victim? And push back. But that takes a lot of courage, and because you're going to be accused of being a misogynist, you're going to be accused of tolerating abuse, you're going to be accused of all kinds of things, when actually all you're trying to do is establish the truth. So if you keep to your core principles, that my job here is to establish the truth, and I'm not saying I don't believe you, but somebody else's life and career is at stake here. um, yeah, but it doesn't happen, and the headline of the accusation always lingers longer than the headline of the, you know what, um, this was wrong, exists. I always thought, this is another example. I always thought journalists should try to look at the news of the day through the lens of, what do you think we might be apologizing for 30 years from now for this? What are we doing today that we think is right? The same way people 150 years ago thought it was right to create residential schools and take children away from their families and force them to be in them. People thought they were doing the right thing. The eugenics movement, people thought they were doing the right thing. The detention camps in the Second World War with Japanese and Italians, people thought they were doing the right thing. And we wind up apologizing for it when everybody thought they were doing the right thing. We are no less human than the people who did that. And some of the things we are doing today, our grandchildren or our children will be apologizing for 20, 30, 40 years from now.
This is the thing.
And
so
this is a great example.
When it comes to this independent investigation from the judge that didn't find he'd committed sexual assault or physical assault, when it comes to this defamation court case, it is, he is presumed to be innocent until being proven guilty, right? But in the public square and in media, it's often the opposite, right, Tara? Like, is that fair to say that it's flipped?
I do want to just remind all of us and our listeners that there is a long history of women suffering sexual assault, and that the process for women coming forward has been very fraught and very, in some cases, damaging, and that we do also owe a duty of care to people who come forward with these allegations. Having said that, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and the way that we do that is through neutral rules and neutral processes, and that yeah, I mean, I think it's telling that some of the most famous feminists in our country, including Margaret Atwood and Susan Swan, came out in favor of due process, and that they have stayed some of the few people willing to go on the record throughout this process. It was incredibly telling that this piece that Marsha Lederman, to her credit, did recently at the Globe and Mail, so few people were willing to go on the record and defend their actions from a decade prior. I think it's very telling. It's very easy in these kinds of stories to get swept up into a kind of moral panic, and those moral panics do not age well over time. And like I said, it's a lot for journalists to balance here, and I think it's very difficult and very fraught and very complicated. These stories often there's very convoluted. There's a lot there. There's a legal process ongoing, so we have to be very careful there. But I think it's possible. I do think it's possible, and I think we have to just keep aiming for neutrality of and have principles that are consistent across stories.
This is the thing. You talk about a tidal wave. It is, like, as you said, things get swept up. Both those horrible men that did horrible things, and women were given the chance to sort of reveal that, and those guys ended up in jail. And then, there's a handful of cases where I guess innocent folks got swept up as well. I say all this saying, like, you probably shouldn't be, he probably would have been fired in the first place, right, for dating a student and, like, having that back and forth with them. But it's a whole separate thing when you start accusing of assault, sexual assault, this sort of thing. Peter, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, Tara's right about, the background of that. So there's legitimate reason for media not want to be part of a process that denies women a fair hearing, which they have been denied historically in terms of that sort of thing. You get it. But people also get swept away by emotion. This reminds me, a former colleague of mine at the Calgary Herald, Naomi Lockritz, told me, this is 2 or 3 years ago, but the tale itself goes back farther, that she once wrote a column that said, it was during the Brett Kavanaugh controversy when he was being appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and accusations came up of a similar nature. And she just wrote a column that said, maybe we should wait for the process till we've heard everything, till we've heard all sides. We wait till this process plays out before we rush to conclusions. And following that, 2 Calgary city councillors refused to speak to the Calgary Herald unless they retracted that column, apologized for ever printing it, and sanctioned the columnist in some other way. And all she had done was ask for people to, hold on, and honestly, Naomi is no Republican, right? But she had just written that, why don't we just, everybody calm down, let's wait and see, let's get the facts on the table, let's be rational about this. And the reaction she got was 2 city councillors trying to ban her newspaper from council chambers. One of those city councillors, by the way, went on to be mayor, Jody Gondek. So that's the sort of pressure journalists face.
Can I just say, let me add my own personal sort of thoughts here. And I think we'll save our bouquet for next time just because we're running out of time. But and I'm interested in your guys' take on this. So, like, I was at a center of this kind of stuff in a way, in that I worked for the Agenda with Steve Paikin when accusations were made by a former mayoral candidate, Sarah Thompson, about him in terms of waiting for things to, be investigated before passing judgment. I commend the former TVO CEO, Lisa DeWilde, who came out immediately with a statement saying, we don't tolerate sexual harassment. However, we stand beside Steve and will be waiting to hear the results of an independent third-party investigation. Until then, he will be staying on air, and journalists dealing with this subject matter will be reporting separately. I remember walking in that morning after seeing a press release, and all of us gathered around the editorial table, and people were crying, including myself, thinking we're not going to have a job, and what's happened here, and a lot of confusion and people throwing accusations, not know what's happening. But then the investigation occurred, the dust settled. There didn't appear to be anything to these allegations. Steve is still on air, and I think he's one of the only cases in which, is someone who survived accusations like this. We'll see what happens with Mr. Galloway. But I just, obviously it's very difficult, and Tara, you can speak more to this, and Robin Doolittle wrote about this a little bit, but both journalists and our corporate bosses at the top, just thinking, let's actually look into this first before we take any steps. If stuff is found, by all means, these people should be punished, and they should have to atone for what they've done. But the idea of just jumping to conclusion, what they did with Stephen Galloway, saying, serious allegations and immediately suspending him, sort of leads the public to then think there's something here, and then a guy's life unravels.
Mm-hmm. And we don't know. I mean, I think I just want to underline that one more time. We do not know. And this case is working its way through the courts, and evidence will be brought forward. And just to be fair to all parties involved, let's just remind everybody that we still don't know. This is in, I will say, in reference to what you were just saying with Robin Doolittle's book, I thought she did a really excellent job with the allegations against Steve Paikin. And I think that is a really important story to be told here as well. And like I said, how do we walk and chew gum at the same time? How do we be fair to all parties involved? How do we stay calm? How do we stay rational? And how do we fight the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle to jump to conclusions? How do we say, we're going to wait here? We're waiting to see. And I think that is the big challenge for journalists of our era. One, humility, and two, wait. Just wait. And
can I add three? Can I add three, which is when we make a mistake, apologize after the fact, even if it's years later. That would be good. You guys stay rational. Thank you so much for joining us this week for another fun episode of Full Press. And I will see you two and our viewers again in 2 weeks' time. Cheers.